You were never just bones and blood. You were born from myth, molded by moonlight, carved out by the longing of survival. Long before you learned shame, desire whispered through the wind. Back then, in the damp womb of caves and wild forests, your fantasies were not forbidden. They were sacred. They fed the fire. You saw it in the hunt, in the heat of skin against skin, in the dance of painted silhouettes across walls smeared with ochre and ash. Lust wasn't dirty, it was divine. You imagined gods with breasts of stone and hips wide as harvest. You sculpted Venus figurines with full bellies and breasts heavy with promise. Fertility wasn't a private affair, it was worshipped, danced for, bled for. You saw sex not as scandal, but as survival. You smeared animal blood on your face before the ritual, not to terrify, but to awaken what slumbered in your blood. The same rhythm that beat through the jungle now thrummed in you. You didn't fantasize in secret. Your desire was carved into temples. In Sumer, women lay with strangers in the name of Inanna, the goddess of love and war. Sacred prostitution, they called it, but you felt it was something deeper, an offering of flesh to the cosmos you weren't afraid to want. In Egypt, you oiled your body under the sun and believed even Ra, the sky god, rose daily out of desire for beauty. Desire lit the heavens. There were no curtains pulled shut, no bedrooms locked from within. You stood naked beneath starlight, not in shame, but in belonging. You were not judged. You were part of a ritual that sang the body's truth. But that wouldn't last. Soon, someone would tell you to cover up. Soon, fantasy would be exiled to the corners of your soul, folded behind curtains of guilt. But not yet. For now you are wild, and your hunger is holy. You haven't yet called it a sin. You haven't yet chained the body to the rules of the mind. You are a beast of instinct and a whisper of God. And right now, that whisper tells you to want. Then came the crowns, the empires, the gold, the polished marble floors. And suddenly, your fantasy wore silken rings and carried a sword. Now, your desire lived in palaces and passed laws. Now, it had servants. But it didn't lose its edge. It only got sharper. You see Caligula, don't you? Draped in white, eyes full of chaos, tasting power through flesh. His fantasies were not hidden. They were decrees. He didn't seduce, he commanded. Sisters, senators, wives, priests, it didn't matter. If he craved, he conquered. His palace was a theater of pleasure and terror, and he made the audience watch. You think your fantasies are dangerous. His changed laws, ended lives, shattered dynasties. In India, the courtesans walked in silk, their ankles whispering with bells. They weren't wives, but they wielded influence sharper than a king's blade. You fantasized about her, not just her body, but her power. She knew the art of scent, the science of moans, the politics of posture. She wasn't owned, she ruled. In China's forbidden city, concubines moved like mist, chosen for more than beauty. You imagined their eyes, trained not to betray thought, but always watching. Each night was a gamble, each fantasy a strategy. Sex was never just sex, it was currency, a favor, a whisper of rebellion. Power did not just rest in thrones. It coiled in sheets, behind fans, beneath perfume. You began to learn that your fantasies could move armies. They could whisper into the ear of an emperor and change a nation's course. You wanted not just bodies, you wanted control. You dreamt of silencing a rival not with a sword, but with a kiss that turned loyalty sideways. You didn't want to love, you wanted to dominate. But that hunger had a cost. Fantasies like these, when they wear a crown, begin to eat their own tail. The pleasure gets louder, the stakes higher, the edge sharper, and the fall always comes. You're still climbing the marble steps, still seduced by gold, still whispering your name into the ears of kings. But soon, you'll hear a new voice, not one of power, but of punishment. And when that voice came, it came wrapped in scripture. Suddenly, you were told that your desires were filth, that your fantasies, once holy and powerful, were now sin carved into your skin. You weren't born bad, but they taught you to believe it. They gave you shame like a second skin and said, "Cover up. God is watching." You walked into churches with your head down, and your hunger buried. They told you the body was a prison and your lust a curse. But deep down, behind stained glass and candle smoke, it still pulsed. You still wanted. You still imagined. But now, every fantasy had a shadow. In medieval Europe, you touched yourself and cried after. Not because it hurt, but because they said it would burn your soul. You dreamed of the nun removing her veil for you, the monk breaking his vow. Not because you hated God, but because they made God hate desire. In the Islamic courts, poets wrote of roses blooming between thighs of the garden of flesh, but always with metaphors. Always in code. Pleasure had to hide inside the curve of a verse. You couldn't say what you wanted, but you could write it in silk, in spice, in songs. In the East, Confucianism demanded order, hierarchy, restraint. Women bound their feet into tiny shapes of obedience, and you watched, both aroused and horrified. Beauty hurt. Lust was control. Fantasy was folded into duty like paper into origami, tight, precise, unseen. But the more they told you not to want, the deeper your fantasies burrowed. They became more vivid, more dangerous. You imagined the priest kissing your mouth mid-sermon. You dreamed of the knight removing his armor in the chapel. You wanted the forbidden, not despite the rules, but because of them. Repression didn't kill your desires, it fed them. It made them hungry, secretive, poetic. You smiled at the surface, bowed at the altar, but inside, you were writing a new story. One where you took back the night. One where you weren't punished for wanting. Because deep down, you knew something they forgot. The more they chained the body, the wilder the mind became. So you rebelled. You broke the silence. You stepped into the light with ink-stained hands and a body unafraid. The Enlightenment didn't just free thought, it loosened the corset on desire. Now, your fantasies spoke French, wore wigs, and spilled wine on Persian rugs. Now, art was your accomplice. You painted naked gods and called it myth. You carved marble curves and called it philosophy. But beneath the brushstrokes was the same fire that burned in caves. Only now it wore lace. The libertines in France turned every salon into a seduction. They didn't whisper. They declared their pleasure like war heroes. And you wanted to be among them. You read their letters under candlelight, the words curling like smoke. I dream of you in red velvet, untouched by virtue. Your fantasy was eloquent now. It had manners. But it still had teeth. In England, Victorians spoke of morality but printed erotic novels under false names. You found them. You read them with trembling hands. Because you understood the more they pretended to be proper, the more their fantasies screamed beneath. Silk hid bruises. Poems hid moans. And in this era, your desire grew more intelligent. It wanted ideas, not just flesh. You fantasized about equality, about choosing who to want, not just being wanted. You dreamed of the salon girl who quoted Voltaire before she kissed you. You imagined not just skin, but minds rubbing together in fever. Artists sketched naked bodies not for scandal, but for beauty, for truth. You looked at a painting of Venus and saw your own desire reflected, curved, relaxed, unashamed. This was your rebellion to want without fear. But even as you celebrated, the world shifted again. Machinery roared, steam rose, cameras blinked, and you stepped into the modern age where your fantasies would no longer be painted. They would be captured, projected, streamed. And that would change everything. Now your fantasies live in pixels. They breathe through glass. You don't need to dream anymore. You just scroll. What was once hidden in temples and whispered in salons is now bookmarked, downloaded, curated. You didn't lose desire, you multiplied it. At first, it felt like freedom. Finally, you could want anything, anyone, anywhere. But then you realized infinity is a prison too. When everything is possible, nothing satisfies. You swipe left not because you're picky, but because you're numb. You once fantasized in color. Now you binge grayscale simulations. You once craved stories. Now you crave loops. You tell yourself it's just fun, harmless, private. But deep down, you wonder, is this mine? Or did someone program me to want it? You find communities, kinks, confessions. Subcultures become identities. Desire no longer needs to hide, but in the open, it feels lonelier. You type your fantasy into a box, press enter, and 1,000 strangers show you their version. But none of them look at you. You remember that sacred ritual, that velvet salon, that forbidden kiss behind a temple wall. It had meaning. You chased beauty with danger, love with risk. But now, it's all right here. Safe, quick, replaceable. And yet, even now, desire isn't dead. It's waiting. Waiting for you to stop watching and start feeling. To remember that the best fantasies aren't just visual, they're visceral. They smell like sweat and sound like laughter and taste like fear. So you unplug for a moment. You breathe. You let your mind wander, not scroll. You imagine someone looking at you, not your profile, but your soul. And there, in that flicker of something real, fantasy returns. Older, deeper, wiser. Because through every age, every war, every lie and law and leash, they never killed your desire. They just tried to shame it. But it's still here. And now, it belongs to you. You think you've seen it all. Think again. The world is full of secrets, hidden truths, and mind-bending realities waiting to be uncovered. What if everything you believe is just the beginning? Hit subscribe, and let's keep unraveling the mysteries that could change everything.